3 remaining Cubans in jails for fighting terrorism. The Cuban 5, Gerardo, Ramon, Antonio, Fernando, and Rene, symbolize the spirit of resistance of our people and the firmness of principles that support the Cuban Revolution. The decision of the Cuban government to begin talks with our government, with the United States government, without Cuba making any concessions of principles, is due to the resistance and strength of our people, which for over 5 decades has built a social project each day more just and inclusive. Nonetheless, in spite of the fact that we consider as positive the steps taken by the current U.S. administration to improve relations with Cuba, the economic, commercial, and financial blockade against the island remains and constitutes the main obstacle for the development of our peoples. We will continue to fight to end this hostile and unilateral policy against Cuba, together with our friends of the United States and with other peoples of the world. Finally, we wish you a productive debate conducive to strengthening of the work of your organization. Kenia Serrano Puig, ICAP President. Thank you. I have a motion that we accept Cuba as an honorary member of UNAC. Do I have a second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those who say no. It's unanimous, and we will communicate that to the NSA. We have now joined the League of Organizations on the U.S. terrorist list, supposedly. And if Cuba is a terrorist country, we live on another planet. Let me tell you about revolutionary Cuba. I went there as an American socialist, if I may admit, and I went to the guard post on the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba, and I said, I want to talk to the leadership of your country. I do that everywhere I go, by the way. I go to the White House, I go to Paris, and I said, I'd like to speak to your leaders. And the Cubans said, welcome, and they brought me inside, and within 20 minutes, I was sitting with 2 members of the Central Committee of Cuba who had a file on me as a social justice activist. All the evil things that I did in the United States were good things in Cuba, fighting against racism and poverty. Cuba is the only nation in the world that mobilized 100,000 people for the freedom of Mumia Abu Jamal in Holgun. And Cuba is the only nation in the world that has opposed every imperialist intervention from the time of its revolution, defeated the counter-revolution, including the American invasion, and has survived what in any other place would have been a 53-year war against it, because it eliminated the whorehouse that the United States organized and supported under the Batista regime. So with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, and I don't want to miss this. His name is Alejandro Molina, and give me 1 second to give him a proper introduction. Where is that? Okay. There's a special reason, not only because he is for the freedom and organizing for the freedom of Oscar Lopez Rivera and has spent a lifetime doing it, but because Oscar was a roommate with one of the Cuban 5 for 5 years in an American prison, and we wanted Alejandro to read Oscar's message to his cellmate, and we wanted to dedicate ourselves like we did to the Cuban 5's freedom, to the freedom of Oscar Lopez Rivera. Alejandro Molina has organized in the Puerto Rican Latino communities in New York, Hartford, San Francisco, and Chicago around the issue of Puerto Rican political prisoners. The editor of USA on Trial, he sits on the coordinating committee of the Natural Boricua Human Rights Network and is playing a leading role in organizing the May 30th, a day for Oscar Lopez Rivera. Let's give a warm welcome to Alejandro Molina.
Buenos días y gracias. Compañeros, it's an honor to be invited to read Oscar's message here. I'll try to be brief and I'll start. Letter from Oscar Lopez Rivera, May 8th, 2015. For those of us who love justice and freedom, want a better and more just world free of colonialism and imperialism, revolutionary Cuba has been and will continue to be a beacon of hope and an example to emulate. It is admirable that Cuba has achieved so many accomplishments in spite of the many attacks the U.S. government has carried out against its government and what it represents, including an invasion, terrorism, the killing over 3,000 Cuban citizens, and a criminal economic embargo. Revolutionary Cuba has been able to set an example of the importance of the development of human resource, of solidarity, and of the need to defend just and noble causes. It started with a nation in shambles, with an economy in chaos, and responding primarily to the economic interests of the USA, a poor educational system, and a deficit in many important professions. But today, Cuba can send doctors and other medical professionals, engineers, teachers, and military personnel to help other countries all over the world. And its literacy program is being used in many parts of the world in order to eradicate illiteracy. It is the most literate country in all of the Caribbean and Latin America. Its praxis in solidarity is unique in the world. One act of solidarity that really reflects the generosity and commitment of Cuba and its government is what it did in Angola in order to stop the racist army of South Africa. As many as 50,000 Cuban soldiers participated in that military operation, and thanks to the Cubans, the South African army was defeated and the back of the apartheid regime broken. This was the reason why Nelson Mandela let the world know that the Cuban people and its government were the best friends he and his people had. And for us Puerto Ricans, Cuba has always been the other wing of the same bird and the greatest supporter in helping us defeat and eradicate colonialism. Cuba is the place where so many of us feel like we are home. At a personal level, I feel indebted to the Cuban government and to the Cuban people. As a Puerto Rican political prisoner, I have been the beneficiary of its generous and enormous support. I have had the honor and privilege to spend over 4 years in prison with Fernando Gonzalez, one of the Cuban Five. Those 4 years have been the best and most meaningful time of the 33 I've spent in prison. Fernando was not only a compañero, but a brother. He incarnated the very best of what the Cuban Revolution has achieved. He earned the respect and admiration of many of the prisoners. They often approach me to ask how he is doing and want me to send their love and respect to him. Since Radio Havana, Cuba, just celebrated its 54th anniversary, I must mention how important the station has been to me. For many years before coming to prison and while in prison, I've been a listener of many of its programs. I want to congratulate the workers of Radio Havana, Cuba, for the great work it has done and continues doing. I want to thank Comandante Fidel Castro, President Raul Castro, the Cuban government and its people for all it has done and for all it has given us. Let's keep on demanding that the embargo be lifted and that Guantanamo is returned to Cuba. Oscar Lopez Rivera.
As you know, it's not an exaggeration to say that Mumia Abu-Jamal is near death. And it's not an accident. They are trying to kill him. They never discovered after 34 years in prison that he was a diabetic and they gave him medication to solve an eczema problem that drove his blood sugar up to 781, 21 points lower than going into diabetic coma. He was in diabetic shock. He could barely walk. They had to take him to the prison infirmary, and when they treated him from eczema with a drug, it exacerbated the situation, and he was near death and could barely speak, and yet he got his messages out to us via prison radio again. It wasn't the first time they tried to kill Mumia. When he approached to defend his brother, Billy Cook, who was being clubbed by a police officer, he was shot in the chest, and he lay on the sidewalk unconscious, and the police picked him up and put him on a stretcher. This is in 1981. They dropped him off the stretcher. They put it on again. They rammed his head against a telephone pole. They threw him in a van and beat the shit out of him, trying to kill him. And they had an officer, Alphonse Giordano, say in charge, he was in charge of the scene, that Mumia said, "Yeah, I'm glad I killed the motherfucker." Giordano never testified because he was indicted, convicted, and imprisoned for being, by the Justice Department and the FBI, for being one of dozens of Philadelphia police who regularly intimidated witnesses, planted evidence, were involved in drugs and all kinds of other activities. And Mumia was their leading critic. And the chief of police who became mayor said that they were going to hold Mumia responsible for his attacks on the Philadelphia Police Department. So Giordano never got a chance. They took him to Jefferson Hospital, unconscious, and they beat him again in the hospital. They put their foot on his drainage bag and tried to force the fluids up into his body once again, and then he survived. And 6 months later, 2 officers who were on the scene said, "Oh, I forgot. He confessed that he killed police officer Faulkner," whereas the medical examiner who was on the scene all the time said, quote, "In the report, the male Negro never spoke a word." They tried to execute him 3 times, but our movement stopped the execution. If it wasn't for the mass mobilization, including 25,000 people in San Francisco and Philadelphia, Mumia would not be alive today. We continue to struggle for his freedom and his very life, and now I'd like to introduce you to the single person who is the founder and leader and longtime fighter for Mumia's life and for all human rights, the founder of the International Concerned Family and Friends, of Mumia Abu Jamal, the indefatigable fighter for the liberty of all political prisoners. Let us welcome Pam Africa.
On the Move family, and thank you. I want to point out very seriously, we got some work to do. I don't want people to be under the illusion that Mumia is in anything but dire need for our help. Mumia, they're definitely trying to kill him. They have never stopped. I visited Mumia last Saturday. And before I go any further, the conditions that Mumia is in is horrific. But Seth Hayes, Jamil Al-Amin, and a lot of political prisoners, Puerto Rican, Asian, and all, and people who are not political prisoners, is under very terrible health conditions. And they want us to sit by and watch. Mumia is that one in millions that can bring attention to the millions that are in there that is suffering under medical neglect. When I visited Mumia last Saturday, and I don't know how many people really know, I'm gonna try to do this fast. When his wife Wadia went to see him the week before I did, she described Mumia as barely able to breathe, walking baby steps to over where she was at. His thighs was huge. He was in constant pain. The skin problem had, bust, and blood was seeping out his arms. And, when I went to visit him Saturday, and things was just about the same. His legs had went down a little bit. The conditions with his skin was the same, but Mumi could walk a little better. He walked like someone who had chains around his ankles and was shuffling like this, and in terrible pain. When I saw Mumia pulled himself together enough to try to make me feel comfortable. That's Mumia. But under these conditions, we're asking people, for those who don't know, Mumia doctor on the outside now can call Mumia and talk with Mumia. He have not been able to see Mumia, touch Mumia. He talks through a lawyer to the Department of Corrections. And had he not been able to do that, we would not have known that one of the drugs that they gave Mumia that caused the swelling and all these things that they stopped a couple weeks ago, they gave him another medication. This medication, when I was on my way to the prison, the lawyer called me, Brett Brody called me to let me know that tell Mumia to call the doctor as soon as possible. Well, what it turned out that phone conversation was about was that they had given Mumia another medication, and which side effects were very harmful. At this particular point, Mumia is refusing to take this medication. They're trying to make him sign a release form stating that they're not responsible if anything happened to him because he won't take the medication. I say they need to sign a release form saying that they are the cause of everything that is happening to Mumia. If release forms have got to be signed, and the reason why the doctor can't see Mumia is behind the fact that they said that if the doctor came in to see Mumia and talk with the other doctors, they can file litigation against them at another time. I'm saying if you're not doing anything wrong, what is your problem with another doctor coming in? Because it's clear. And some people call it medical neglect. I call it straight out attempted homicide on Mumia. When we couldn't get in contact with Mumia and the prison wasn't giving us information, people said, well, what are we going to do? This was when Wadia saw him and put out the alarm of what was going on. Prison wouldn't answer, governor office wouldn't answer. I said, call 911. There's a crime being committed here. But people was taking that lightly. I'm serious. And file a police report. A murder is happening while we sit back and look. I'm saying we're doing everything that we can within this movement to put pressure, but we got to step it up a little bit more, because while we're waiting for things to happen and to get in the court, we got to demand, and I'm saying we got to demand and be up front, where we're visible, and to demand that Mumia's doctor be allowed to come in. First demand is release Mumia because Mumia is innocent. And we do have the information to prove that. But in the meantime, I saw it. But in the meantime, let us all gather and go and do what is necessary. And like this governor's event that they're having in San Francisco in June, where not governors, the mayors is coming together. I think we need to be there, lifting our voices not only for Mumia, but for every other person. On July 25th, and the march in Newark, we must be a part of that for all over against police brutality and every other social injustice that's happening. But please understand that this is the time, And we got these people pinned. All the information is there to stop this murder. Let us not take baby steps as they have forced Mumia to do to move and to get around. Let's take giant steps, leaps, and do what is necessary. Let's come together with a plan and to actually stop this murder of Mumia and other political prisoners. Mumia, I got one.